Hello, and welcome to Slow Sleep Stories. Thanks. Before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere cozy, let me know in the comments where you are and what time it is. I love seeing how far this story travels. Now, turn off the lights, get comfortable, and let's go on this journey together tonight. Take a deep breath, the kind that begins in your belly and gently rises up to your chest. Let it out slowly, like a sigh you didn't know you needed to release. This moment is yours now. Let your jaw hang loose. It's probably been holding tension all day. No need for that here. Let your tongue rest gently at the roof of your mouth. Now smooth the space between your eyebrows like you're wiping away a tiny worry with your breath. Imagine your face softening like warm snow under a sunrise. Your eyelids are getting heavier, not because you're tired, but because they're safe enough to settle down. Now your shoulders, those heavy, loyal carriers of your day, let them drop a little. You don't need to carry anything anymore, not right now. Each arm is like a cozy wool scarf being folded neatly on a shelf. From your fingertips to your elbows to your upper arms, everything is sinking softly, slowly. Breathe again. Let it be slower this time. That's right. Bring your attention to your chest. Can you feel the subtle rise and fall? It's like ocean waves, only slower, quieter. With each breath, you drift further into stillness. There's no rush. Your body is not a clock tonight. Feel your back melt into the bed. Let gravity take over. Now it's been waiting to help. Your spine relaxes, vertebra by vertebra, like a zipper, gently unfastening your legs. Oh, they've walked enough. Let the thighs release, the knees let go, calves unwind. Ankles melt like butter over warm bread. Even your toes are smiling now, each one like a tiny lighthouse blinking goodnight. Now, let's tuck in your thoughts. Picture a snowfield, empty, untouched. No footprints yet, no rush to make any, just clean, white, calm, stretching as far as your imagination lets it. That's where we're going. And in this snowy quiet, nothing asks anything of you. The cold is soft, not biting, like the chill of fresh sheets in winter. Somewhere off in the distance, there's a soft hum, like wind making peace with the world. If a thought wanders in perhaps about your day or your to-do list, greet it like a snowflake. Admire its detail, then let it melt on your mitten and disappear. You don't have to hold anything. Let the world get fuzzy at the edges. Let details blur like lights through frosted glass. No need to think in full sentences anymore. And as your breath becomes your rhythm, steady, gentle, like the tide under moonlight, I'll take you somewhere. Tonight, it starts with a man wrapped in fur, standing quietly in the snow. He's old, but not fragile, strong like driftwood, soft like a worn parka. His cheeks are ruddy, not from embarrassment, but from wind kisses earned over a long, long life. He stands at the edge of a frozen field, where his breath leaves the faintest cloud behind. In the silence, he listens, not for danger, for stories. You see, the snow speaks to him, not in words, oh, no, it's far more polite than that. It whispers with crunches, with breezes, with tiny flutters on his eyelashes. And just ahead of him, in that pale blue light that only snowfields know, are footprints, not fresh, not melting, not his own, not headed anywhere. They form a perfect circle. He tilts his head like a curious raven. Circles aren't common here. In the tundra, people walk in straight lines, efficient, direct. A circle, that's something else. He takes one step forward, then stops. From deep in his memory, something stirs his grandmother's voice, perhaps, or maybe just the echo of a lullaby. The air tastes like snowberries. He doesn't move closer yet. He just listens. The wind picks up slightly, but not to hurry him. It's more like a friend clearing its throat. He smiles, and just then, a joke floats into his head, something about how his knees creak louder than his old sled dog ever did. He chuckles, softly, and the snow catches the sound like it's saving it for later. There's a story here, and tonight you're going to follow it with him, but not all at once. No rush, remember. For now, just know that footprints that go in circles might not be lost. They might be waiting for someone calm enough to notice Dot, and that someone might just be you. The old manlets call him Nana lifted one boot and placed it gently beside the circle of prints. The snow gave a soft crunch, like it recognized his foot and welcomed it back. He squinted. The prints weren't new, but they weren't fading either, as if someone had pressed them in not yesterday, not this morning, but in a moment that simply never ended. They were wider than his own, slightly flatter, too, not human, but not exactly animal either. Nanak scratched his chin, his mitten rubbing against the stiff whiskers of his beard. He wasn't alarmed. In fact, he felt oddly comforted, as if the footprints had been waiting for him specifically. He turned his head slightly, looking back toward the distant outline of his villager, few low igloos glowing with the faint orange warmth of oil lamps. He could return, of course. His niece would be cooking seal soup by now, probably talking to herself as she stirred the pot. But the prince were more polite than his niece, and twice as quiet. He bent down, placing a gloved hand near the indentation in the snow. He didn't touch it, no need to disturb what hadn't disturbed him. He closed his eyes instead, and for a moment, just a moment, he heard something. It wasn't a voice. It was more like humming, faint, gentle, a tune his bones remembered, but his brain couldn't name. He opened his eyes. The snow was the same still, except now the footprints seemed to be smiling. "Ah," he said aloud, his voice soft like bear fur. "So you're in a good mood today." This was the thing about Nanak. He never assumed he was alone, even when he clearly was. The land had ears, the wind had jokes, the snow had opinions. So he followed. Not around the circle, oh no, that would have been too neat. He walked beside the prince, letting them run parallel to his own path, like a quiet companion keeping pace but never speaking out of turn. As he walked, the wind shifted, brushing against his cheeks in little bursts, the kind that make your nose itch and your memories shuffle forward like playing cards. He remembered the first time he'd seen snow, not the snow itself, but the way his mother had described it. It falls like sky feathers, she had said, but it lands like dreams. He smiled. A gust danced past, tugging at his hood like a mischievous child. All right, he muttered. "I'm going." He crested a small rise, nothing dramatic, just a hill the size of a sleeping walrus. From the top, he saw a flat stretch of white leading toward the frozen bay. The prince continued, still circling, still making no progress, and yet refusing to vanish. And then he saw her, his niece. She was standing with her hands on her hips, her parka slightly askew, the tip of a spoon still in one mittened hand. "Forgot lunch," she called out, clearly unimpressed. Again, he raised both hands like a guilty schoolboy. "I was following the snow," he replied, as if that answered everything. She stomped up the hill, but slowly, as if the stomp was more for drama than speed. Her boots crunched crisply, her cheeks were bright from the cold, her eyes brighter from something else, affection, maybe, or exasperation. Hard to tell with her. "You mean these?" she asked, pointing at the footprints. He nodded. "They've been there since last week," she said. "We all thought it was a walrus with cold feet." Nanak chuckled. A shy one. Perhaps she handed him a small bundle lukewarm seal soup in a seal bladder pouch, tied neatly with sinew. "Next time you go wandering off, take your lunch with you," she scolded, but not unkindly. He took it, nodding in thanks. "And next time you forget to salt the soup, I'll pretend I like it." She made a face. "You always pretend you like it." "Exactly," he grinned. They sat side by side on the snowy rise, legs stretched out like twin shadows. Nanak slurped his soup. His niece watched the prints. "You think they're from something real?" she asked after a moment. He didn't answer right away, just swallowed, wiped his mouth with the back of his glove, and said, "Not everything that's real leaves footprints, and not everything with footprints is trying to go somewhere." She frowned. "That sounds like something grandmother would say it is." He nodded. She used to say it while brushing snow out of her eyebrows. The two of them watched the footprints for a while longer. Then his niece leaned over and whispered, "Sometimes I think the snow is dreaming us." Nanak blinked. That was new. "That's a good line," he murmured. "I heard it from the wind," she said, grinning. He laughed, loudly, richly, the sound bouncing off the frozen air like a drumbeat. Then he stood, stretched, and looked again at the prints. They hadn't moved, but neither had he. "Really, come," he said to his niece. "We've got a story to finish, even if it never ends." And with that, they walked down the hill, side by side, with the footprints keeping gentle pace beside them just like before. Only now they weren't alone. That night, under a sky spangled with stars brighter than any lantern, Nanak sat by the hearth inside his igloo. The heat came not only from the burning whale oil, but from the warm snores of his niece curled up nearby, her hair still dusted with snowflakes she hadn't bothered to brush off. Outside, the wind had quieted into something closer to a purr, the sort of sound that made you think the world had pulled a great fur blanket over itself and decided to rest. Not yet. He stirred the pot of leftover soup with the end of a carved bone spoon. It made a soft slosh that reminded him of the tide kissing the edges of a kayak. His mind kept returning to the footprints, not because they were strange things happened all the time, but because they felt familiar, like a joke he'd almost remembered, or a tune from a dream he didn't know he'd had. The elders' council had dismissed them last week, said it was probably a wandering muskox, or, more likely, an ambitious child playing a prank. But Nanak had followed the prints. He'd seen the way they curved, like someone walking in a story, not in a hurry. He looked across the igloo, at the long fur coat draped over a carved seal bone rack. His grandmother's coat, the one she'd worn when telling bedtime tales, often while shelling sea urchins and laughing so hard she nearly choked on them. That coat was always warm, even when no one wore it. He reached for it, draped it around his shoulders, and stepped outside. The night air nipped at his cheeks, but the coat held the cold at bay. He looked to the Hilva, same one with the circle of prints. It gleamed under the starlight. He hadn't intended to go, but his feet had other ideas. Snow crunched beneath his boots, each step sounding like a quiet yes. He didn't rush it. Wasn't that sort of walk. It was a meander, like thoughts drifting before sleep, or dreams deciding whether to knock Dot halfway to the hill. He paused. The footprints were back, perfectly round again, still unbroken, still waiting, but now the center of the circle, something new, a lump, just a small one, like a pile of snow he hadn't noticed before. But there was something odd about the shape. It wasn't round, not exactly, more like folded. He knelt beside it, brushing away snow gently, like peeling back the edge of a storybook. And there it was, a small bundle, wrapped in layers of woven seal gut and caribou hide, tied with twine made from sinew. It looked old, older than the village, maybe older than Nanak's beard, which had been gray since before the last volcano hiccuped. He didn't open it, not yet. He simply sat beside it, the snow making a faint creak beneath him, as if trying to eavesdrop. "You're patient," he murmured to the bundle. "I'll give you that." And then, because it felt right, he began to hum. It wasn't a planned song, just something low and slow, with no real tune, like water boiling, or wind traveling through spruce. He rocked slightly, back and forth, and the stars blinked approvingly. Behind him, something shuffled. He turned, not startled, not tense, just curious. His niece was there, arms crossed, squinting like she wandered out mid-dream. "You always find the weird stuff," she muttered. Nauq, grin. "The weird stuff finds me." She walked over, knelt beside him, and eyed the bundle. "Should we open it?" He hesitated, then, with a slow nod, began untying the twine. Each layer he peeled back revealed more care, more detail. Whoever had wrapped this had done so with intention, not haste. Finally, the last layer fell away. Inside, a mask, carved from driftwood, smoothed by time. The features were soft, wide cheeks, a slightly crooked smile, and eyes that looked closed, yet also awake. Nauq ran a finger along the curve of its brow. "I know this face," he whispered. His niece looked at him. "Whose is it?" He didn't answer, not with words. Instead, he lifted the mask to his face, just for a moment, and the world changed, not dramatically. There were no flashes, no wind gusts, just a quiet shift. The stars pulsed once, in a rhythm like breath. The snow sighed, and from far, far away, a voice not male, not female, not young, not old, spoke a single word. "Continue." Nauq opened his eyes. The circle was gone. So were the footprints, just smooth snow now, blank again. His niece stood silently beside him, staring. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither said anything, and together they walked back, the bundle between them. Later, as Nauq drifted into sleep, he felt the snow whisper again, soft and kind, and just a little mischievous. "Dream with your boots on," it said, just in case. By morning, the snow had begun to speak in full sentences, not in words. Of course, snow rarely bothers with grammar, but in the way it drifted against the side of Nanok's igloo, rustled past his ears, and folded itself into little hills. That seemed to spell something, if only you tilted your head just right. Nanuq. Tilted his head, still nothing. He sighed contentedly and stepped outside, his boots making that soft, chuffing sound like slippers on thick carpet. He carried the mask now in a satchel made of old otter skin. It was warm in there, too warm, maybe. Every so often, the bag would feel like it wriggled, but only slightly, like it was uncomfortable with stillness. His niece was already out by the seal racks, complaining to no one about the stiffness of frozen flippers and the tragic laziness of sunrises in winter. "I had a dream about the footprints," she announced as he approached. "Was I in it?" "You were a snow hare. You kept yelling something about hot chocolate. Sounds accurate." She wiped her brow dramatically, though there was no sweat to wipe. "I think the snow's trying to tell us a story. It always is. But I mean this time, specifically." Nanok nodded toward the satchel. "Let's find out where the mask wants to go." So they walked again, this time with fewer questions and more snacks. Dried fish, some root chips, and a pouch of cranberry paste that had somehow fermented into something surprisingly cheerful. As they crossed the ice-blown landscape, the air grew familiar, not warm, not cold, but something in between, like the memory of warm hands inside cold mittens. After an hour measured only by stomach grumbles, they reached the ancient drift. It was a place every child knew about, but few bothered to visit. A ridge of snow dunes that never moved, even when the wind tried its hardest. Legend said they'd formed when a giant yawned during a snowstorm and never cleaned up after himself. They climbed the dunes, their boots squeaking slightly, like rubber toys, confessing secrets. At the top, they found a hollow, perfectly round indentation, as if something large and round had taken a polite nap there. In the middle of the hollow stood a short post carved from whale rib, half buried in the snow. It looked expectant. Pulled out the mask. The snow held its breath. He placed the mask gently on the post. Nothing happened. At least, not at first. Then the mask shivered just once, and the snow began to glow. Not brightly, not like fire or lanterns, but softly, like moonlight trapped in cotton. The glow radiated in a slow spiral outward from the mask, etching pale patterns into the snow, concentric rings, like ripples from a dropped pebble in a still pond. "That's not normal." "No," Nanak agreed, his voice soft but very polite. The patterns continued outward, revealing symbols, ones his grandmother used to carve into sealskin bags when she wanted to confuse the ravens. Spirals, fishtails, small dancing feet, a story. The snow was telling a story. It began with a village knot, unlike theirs, but upside down, literally. The igloos hung from the sky like jellyfish domes. People walked on clouds. Fish flew through the air, while birds swam in the sea. It was a quiet chaos. No one minded much. Then came a traveler. He had no name and no home, only a long scarf made of midnight and a walking stick that whistled when it tapped the ground. The traveler visited the upside-down village and did a curious thing. He slept for 3 days on the edge of a dream dune, snoring quietly, and when he awoke, he left behind footprints that never melted, exactly like the ones Nanak had followed. His niece whispered, "Is it showing us?" him. I think it's showing. Us, ourselves. The snow rippled again, the images now fading slowly, like breath on a window pane. The mask stopped glowing. The post stood still. The wind, bashful, started up again in tiny puffs, like it had been waiting its turn to play. They sat for a while. Finally, his niece said, "So what now?" Nanak leaned back, arms crossed behind his head. "Now we rest and wait." For what? For the footprints to move. And with that, he closed his eyes. She watched him for a moment. Then she lay down too, right beside him. The snow tucked itself around them. The sky blinked lazily, and somewhere beneath the ice, a sleeping traveler snored, just once. When Nanak awoke, it was to the quiet murmur of a landscape rearranging itself. Snow does this sometimes, not loudly, not with any rush, but like a house guest, gently fluffing your pillows and moving your mug just an inch closer to your hand. Thoughtful, but a little spooky. He sat up slowly, brushing frost from his beard. The ridge of dunes around them now looked different, more curved, more welcoming, like the walls of a snow amphitheater, waiting for a concert of very sleepy wails. Niece was already awake, carving something in the snow with a stick. It was a lazy sketch of the mask's face-rounded cheeks, sleepy eyes, slightly amused mouth. She had added a crown, just for fun. Nanuq stretched his joints, cracking softly like old parchment. "Anything strange happened while I napped?" She nodded. The post moved. He looked to the center of the hollow. Indeed, the whale rib post now leaned ever so slightly west, as if indicating a direction. The mask still perched on top, quiet but dignified, like a goose pretending to be a judge. "Well," Nanak said, standing, "I suppose it wants us to follow." "You suppose a lot of things," she replied, standing beside him. "Correctly," he added. They walked again, this time heading west, guided by the faint tilt of an ancient post and the hunch that perhaps naps weren't quite finished with them yet. The snow beneath their feet was smooth as marshmallow icing, their footprints vanishing behind them almost instantly as they traveled. Nanak began to hum an old tune his grandmother used to sing while fishing for the kind of fish that pretended not to be fish, the kind that made eye contact and then swam away sideways just to be rude. His niece joined in, adding a harmony that wasn't quite in tune but had a lot of enthusiasm. Birds overhead tilted their wings to listen, then decided to mind their own business. After a short while, they reached an unusual landmark, a circle of small stone, black as squid ink and warm to the touch. In the middle, a sealskin tent, old, weather-beaten, but perfectly intact. Nanak raised an eyebrow. "Wasn't here last week," his niece sniffed. "Wasn't here yesterday." They exchanged a glance, then ducked inside. The tent smelled of wood smoke, old lavender, and stories that had waited too long to be told. Inside sat a woman, or maybe not a woman, more like a presence in the shape of one. Her eyes were closed, yet somehow she saw them. Her skin shimmered like heat rising from sea ice, and her hair was braided with bones, small enough to belong to mice or myths. She spoke before either of them could. "You found the mask." Nanak nodded. "You followed the prince." "Yes, you saw the snow's story." "We did." The woman, or perhaps the echo of once mine. "Then you've remembered what was forgotten." Nanak tilted his head. Could you be a touch less poetic? My niece gets cranky when people go full oracle. The woman chuckled softly. It sounded like water boiling in a seal bladder, comforting in its own way. You are the dream walker now, she said. The mask has chosen you. Nanak glanced at his niece. She raised a finger. Is there like a schedule for that? Does it come with snacks? The woman gestured to a low table where dried berries and strips of frozen meat waited politely. No one ever accused oracles of being bad hosts. They sat and ate, the food surprisingly good for having been prepared in a tent that hadn't existed a day ago. As they munched, the woman told them the rest of the story. Long ago, before snow had, memory and wind had mood swings, the land was guarded by the Watcher of Dreams, a gentle trickster spirit who wore a mask carved from the first driftwood to wash up after the last ice melt. The Watcher wandered the north, soothing restless minds, collecting unfinished dreams, and occasionally playing tricks on fishermen who lied about their catches. When the Watcher grew tired, it buried the mask in snow and whispered its path into the wind, knowing that someday someone with warm hands and a curious nose would find it again. You followed that whisper, the woman said. You are now its keeper. Nanook frowned. Does this involve paperwork? The woman smiled. Only dreams and footprints. Nanak leaned back. The tent seemed to pulse around him like a slow heartbeat. The mask in the satchel felt heavier now, not in weight, but in purpose. His niece crunched on a berry. What if we don't want to be the keepers? Then the snow will wait again. That sounded worse, somehow. Nan, UQ, sighed. All right. What do we do? You sleep, she said. They blinked. That's it, his niece asked. The woman nodded. And when you sleep, you dream. And when you dream, you walk. And when you walk, you leave footprints. And the snow will follow. Nanak looked around the tent. It already felt like part of a dream. Well then, he said, stretching out on the floor, better get started. His niece followed suit, curling up beside him. The mask, still resting in its satchel, seemed to hum faintly, and as their eyes drifted closed, the woman's form shimmered like heat and slowly faded, leaving behind only the scent of lavender, the warmth of dream fire, and the quiet echo of a laugh that might have belonged to the first snowflake ever born. The night came on slow, as if the world were pulling its blankets tighter, settling in for a long sleep. Nanak and his niece lay in the warmth of the tent, the crackle of unseen fires gently filling the air with its sleepy melody. The stars outside twinkled softly, almost lazily, as though they were blinking in and out of existence between yawns. Nanak's mind drifted, the memories of the mask, the snow, and the woman becoming less clear with every breath. The snow's story was there somewhere, like a distant echo, but it wasn't ready to make sense yet. Perhaps it was simply the nature of things in this strange, quiet land. His niece was already asleep beside him, her breath slow and even, a peaceful smile playing on her lips. Nanak couldn't help but wonder what dreams she would have. Would they be filled with the symbols from the mask, the footprints, the snow patterns, the glow that had danced across the cold world? Or would her mind find new paths, new shapes to explore, while the snow continued its quiet story? The snow outside, as if in answer, began to whisper. It wasn't a voice, not exactly. It was more of a sensation, like the wind was carrying something long forgotten from the deepest corners of the earth. Secrets buried under layers of ice and snow. The air felt different, Nassau, but charged with something ancient. Nanuq closed his eyes, his body sinking deeper into the soft furs beneath him. His breath slowed, his thoughts becoming fuzzy as sleep crept closer. And then, like an unexpected tide, the dream began. It started with a familiar feeling, the sensation of walking on snow, but without the coldness. The snow was warm underfoot, smooth as glass, and the world was cast in a golden, soft glow. He wasn't sure if it was sunrise or sunset, but it didn't matter. Time had no hold here. The footprints were there, only they weren't his. They were larger, deeper, as if something heavy had walked through the snow recently. He followed them, step by step, through the landscape that seemed to breathe with him, as if the world itself was watching, listening. The path led him to the edge of a vast, frozen sea. The water was still, not a ripple to be seen. In the distance, a small figure stood, outlined by the soft, golden light. The figure didn't move. It was as still as the sea itself, yet somehow it was not a part of the landscape, but a visitor. Nanak felt drawn toward the figure, as if the very snow was pulling him in its direction. He walked closer, his breath shallow, until the figure finally turned. It was the mask's, the same one that had led them here, but the mask was different now. It floated in midair, its features shifting like clouds, its face not fixed, but changing now, smiling, now serious, now curious. It was the face of the world itself, a patchwork of all the creatures, all the spirits, all the winds that had ever existed in this land. The mask tilted slightly, as though waiting for something. Nanak stopped just short of it, unsure of what he was supposed to do. Then, the figure raised its hand and pointed toward the sky. The stars above had begun to move, swirling slowly in a slow dance that filled the heavens. Each star became a dot of light, a seed floating in the dark. They connected, forming lines, then patterns, constellations, stretching far beyond what Nanak had ever seen, spreading out like veins of light across the sky. A voice filled the air. It wasn't spoken, but felt like a vibration in his bones. "You are the keeper now," the voice said, low and steady, echoing in his chest. "The footprints will follow you." The mask's shifting face grew clearer. Now it seemed to be smiling, gently, not maliciously. It wasn't a trickster face, not quite. It was something older, more patient, as though it had been waiting for a very long time for someone to remember the steps. Suddenly, the snow beneath his feet gave way, not with a crash, but gently, as if the earth was inviting him to lie down and rest. And so he did, sinking into the soft powder like a boat into a calm lake. The voice returned. "Rest, keeper. You are the bridge now between the land of the awake and the land of dreams. The snow will tell its story, one footprint at a time." And then the stars blinked out, and the snow wrapped him in its soft embrace. Nanak awoke with a soft breath, the dream lingering around him like a quiet fog. The air in the tent was still, the fire's warmth a quiet hum in the background. His niece was still asleep, curled up beside him, but the world outside had shifted. The mask in its satchel seemed heavier now. It wasn't just an artifact, it was a key. He sat up slowly, careful not to disturb his niece, and opened the bag. The mask rested there calm and expectant, waiting for him to make the next move. The world outside, still blanketed in snow, felt both familiar and new, like the first snowfall of winter, or the feeling of a place that you know but didn't realize you knew so well. He glanced over at his niece, still lost in her dreams, and smiled. Yes, the journey was far from over. The dawn had begun to stretch its fingers across the sky, casting a soft golden glow that felt like the world itself was waking up from a long nap. Nanak sat quietly in the tent, the mask still in his hands, studying it as if it held all the answers in the world. There was a weight to it now, one that went beyond its physical form. It wasn't just a piece of driftwood and bone. It was a reminder, a connection to something ancient, something alive. His niece shifted beside him, slowly waking with the natural grace of someone who didn't rush into the day. She opened one eye, squinting up at him, and then smiled sleepily. "What time is it?" Nanak chuckled softly. "A time for sleeping or a time for waking? I suppose it depends on your perspective, right? Well, I think I'll choose waking," she said, stretching like a cat and letting out a tiny yawn. The day ahead was quiet. The world felt still, almost as if it were holding its breath. The mask, now resting in Nanak's hands, seemed to pulse softly with an energy he couldn't explain. It wasn't a hum. It wasn't a vibration. It was more like a soft thrum, a heartbeat that existed somewhere just beneath the surface of reality. "We should get moving," he said after a long pause, glancing out at the snowy landscape beyond the tent. "We have more to learn, more dreams to discover." His niece nodded. "What if we don't want to? What if the snow's tired of telling stories?" Nanak smiled, tucking the mask back into the satchel. "I don't think the snow ever gets tired of telling its stories. And besides," he added, standing and offering her a hand, "sometimes we don't need to know everything. We just need to listen." With that, they packed up their belongings, slipping out of the tent and into the soft, glowing morning. The world outside was still blanketed in snow, but there was a sense of calm, of expectancy. The footprints were waiting for them, just as they had been the day before. The path they had followed had changed overnight, subtly shifting, as though the land itself had moved in response to their presence. Nanak stepped forward, his boots crunching softly in the fresh snow. His niece, ever curious, was at his side, studying the patterns in the snow with the kind of focus only children possess when they're truly interested in something. She looked up at him and smiled, holding up her hand to point to something in the distance. "Do you see that?" she asked. The footprints looked different now, like they're leading somewhere. Nanak followed her gaze. The snow was still, perfect, untouched by anything except the footprints they had made. But there, just ahead, was a subtle change. The footprints seemed to widen, as if inviting them to follow. "It's like they're telling us to go there," his niece said, already beginning to move toward them. Nanak nodded. "Yes, that's exactly it. They're not just footprints, they're guidance. They've been waiting for us." They walked in silence for a while, their steps soft in the snow, the mask's quiet presence ever at Nanak's side. He felt its weight with each step, as though it were growing more and more connected to him. The snow whispered as they moved, tiny flurries of sound that were barely perceptible, but comforting nonetheless. The path led them to the edge of a great ice shelf, where the snow met the frozen sea. The air here was crisp, fresh, so cold that it almost hurt to breathe too deeply, but still beautiful in its sharpness. In the distance, something glimmered, Ed, at first. Nanak thought it was just another trick of the light, the sun reflecting off the ice in such a way that it created a bright, almost blinding gleam. But as they drew closer, the gleam grew more defined, taking shape. A structure, a building of sorts, carved from the very ice and snow itself. The snow beneath their feet became slick as they neared, the path growing steeper and more uneven. Nanak felt the pull of the mask, the quiet thrum in his hands, urging him forward. His niece, walking a few paces ahead, looked back at him, her eyes wide with wonder. This is real, right? She asked, her voice filled with awe. It's not just a dream. Nanak smiled, the corner of his lips twitching. What's the difference between a dream and what's real? He asked softly. His niece didn't answer, but her eyes sparkled with curiosity as they continued toward the structure. As they drew closer, the building became clearer, a circular dome of ice and snow, glistening like a giant frozen bubble. At the entrance stood a large stone archway, adorned with intricate carvings that looked like a blend of animal tracks and constellations. It was a doorway, but not a normal one. This was a door between worlds, or so it seemed. The wind had picked up slightly, carrying with it the scent of the sea and something else, something faint, almost like the smell of something burning. Nanak couldn't place it, but it seemed oddly comforting, like the smell of an old fire in the hearth. His niece stood at the threshold, looking up at the archway with a mix of excitement and uncertainty. "Do we go in?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Nanak took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the mask against his side. "We've come this far. The mask has led us here. Let's see what it has to show us." And with that, they stepped into the ice structure inside. The air was warmer, more inviting, and the light was soft, like a room that had been waiting for them. The walls were covered in markings, not just drawings, but layers of them. A history of stories written not with ink, but with the passage of time itself. It was a library of the land, a collection of the whispers of the snow. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on it rested a stone tablet, glowing faintly with the same soft golden light they had seen in their dreams. Nanak approached, reaching out for the tablet. The moment his fingers brushed its surface, the room seemed to pulse, and the mask at his side hummed. The land was waiting for its story to be told. The moment Nanak's fingers made contact with the glowing stone tablet, the room seemed to shudder, a deep, resonant vibration that filled the air around them. For a heartbeat, everything was still, and then the stone began to glow brighter, its edges softening as if it were alive, warming under his touch. His niece stepped forward cautiously, her wide eyes reflecting the golden light. "What's happening?" she whispered, as though afraid to disturb whatever was unfolding before them. Nanak's voice was steady, though he felt a flutter of unease in his chest. "I think... the mask is speaking to us. It's opening something." He could hear it now, the faint hum of energy filling the space, almost like a song. A melody so ancient it felt like it had always been here, hidden beneath the surface of the world, waiting for someone to unlock it. The tablet's glow intensified, casting long shadows across the walls, the markings on them beginning to shift and move as if they were alive. And then something extraordinary happened. The symbols on the tablet began to rearrange themselves, morphing into shapes Nanak had never seen before. They were patterns, not words, but something deeper, something primal. They resembled the footprints they had been following, symbols of movement, of life, of something larger than themselves. The soft hum in the air grew louder, and Nanak felt the ground beneath him tremble ever so slightly, as though the very earth was waking up in response to the tablet's activation. His niece reached out tentatively, her small hand brushing the stone. Instantly, the hum became a steady pulse, like the beating of a heart, and the air grew warmer, more vibrant. The walls of the structure flickered with the same golden glow, and it felt as though the room had expanded, becoming larger, more infinite, as if it were part of something much greater than a simple ice dome. Then a voice, not a sound, but a feeling, a pulse in their very bones. "You have come far," the voice whispered, echoing in their minds. "You have unlocked the path." Nanak's heart skipped a beat. He looked down at the stone tablet, his fingers still resting on its glowing surface. The voice was not from the tablet, nor from the walls. It seemed to come from the air itself, from the space between them and the world. "Who are you?" Nanak asked, his voice low, barely above a breath. The voice responded, soft but clear. "I am the keeper of the first stories, the guardian, paths that have not been walked." Nanak felt the weight of the words settle over him. The keeper of stories, the one who held the knowledge of all those who had come before. This was not just a mask, not just an artifact. This was a guide, a bridge between worlds. "The mask," Nanak said, his voice trembling slightly. "It led us here. It led me." Here, the voice, gentle yet certain, responded, "The mask is more than you know. It is the key to unlocking the path between this world and the one beyond. You are its new keeper. The footprints you follow are not just steps, they are stories, waiting to be told." Nanak swallowed, his hand tightening around the tablet. His niece, standing beside him, looked up at him, her eyes wide with wonder, though there was a quiet understanding there too. It was as if she could feel the weight of the moment as well. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice steady, despite the enormity of the situation. The voice answered without hesitation, "Now, you must tell the stories. You must walk the path that was carved by those who came before, and by those who will follow. You must learn the stories of the world." Nanak glanced at the mask at his side. It pulsed softly, its edges shifting as though it were alive, waiting. It was the key, it was the connection, but it was more than that. It was a responsibility, one he wasn't sure he was prepared for. The room began to shift again. The walls seemed to blur, the markings becoming fluid, like streams of water that never stopped flowing. The tablet's glow dimmed slightly, as if it were allowing the world outside to begin to filter in. The air smelled sweeter now, lighter, like the sea breeze that had begun to move through the frozen landscape outside. Nanak stepped away from the tablet, pulling his niece gently by the hand. "We have to go," he said softly. "The path is waiting for us. The stories are waiting." His niece nodded, still looking back at the tablet, her mind clearly racing with questions. But she said nothing, trusting him as she always did. Together, they turned toward the entrance of the ice structure, the door now wide open, allowing the golden light to spill out into the snow. Outside, the world was still blanketed in a soft, quiet. The path they had been following was clearer now, the footprints unmistakable in their direction. They walked back into the snow, the mask resting at Nanak's side, its presence grounding him in a way he hadn't expected. The world felt different now, as though the very snow beneath his feet had changed, had grown softer, more welcoming. The journey ahead was still unclear, but it was theirs to take. The snow continued its slow dance around them, swirling in gentle flurries that sparkled in the golden light. The land was alive with stories, and Nanak was ready to hear them, one step at a time. And so they walked, the footprints before them, glowing faintly, inviting them into the unknown. The air had a quiet sharpness to it as Nanak and his niece continued their journey. The golden light from the ice structure behind them seemed to fade, replaced by the cool, crisp radiance of the snow-filled world. The mask at Nanak's side still pulsed faintly with warmth, a steady rhythm, almost as if it were breathing. His niece, ever the curious one, couldn't contain her wonder. "Uncle, do you think the stories are really out there?" she asked, her voice bright with anticipation. Nanak glanced down at her, the wind catching her hair and sending it into a light swirl around her face. He smiled gently, his eyes twinkling. "I think," he said thoughtfully, "the stories are everywhere. They are in the snow beneath our feet, in the wind that whispers through the trees, and in the dreams we have when we sleep. But what if we can't hear them?" she asked, her brow furrowing in concern. "Ah," Nanak replied, pausing for a moment, "the stories are always there. It's just that sometimes we need to listen more closely, or perhaps be a little quieter. When we're still, when we let go of everything else, ... the stories will come to us." His niece nodded, though there was still a flicker of doubt in her eyes. Nanak could see that she wasn't fully convinced, but he knew this journey would teach her in time. She had the heart of a seeker, the kind of child who would never stop looking for answers, even in the most quiet of places. They continued walking, the snow beneath their feet crunching with each step. The footprints they were following were becoming clearer, more defined, leading them up a gentle incline toward the base of a distant mountain. As they climbed, the world seemed to grow quieter, as if the snow itself were muffling the sound of their footsteps, leaving only the soft whoosh of the wind in the distance. Nanak could see something else, now something that had not been there when they first arrived, a series of large stones arranged in a circle at the top of the hill. It was strange to see them there, as if they had simply appeared out of nowhere. "We're close," Nanak said, his voice low. "We must be." His niece looked up, her eyes wide. "What do you think they are?" Nanak squinted toward the stones. There was something both ancient and sacred about them, a sense of reverence in the way they stood tall against the sky. "I think," he began, "those stones are part of the story we're meant to hear. They're markers guiding us forward." As they reached the stones, they paused. The circle was wide, each stone massive and covered in snow, but the center was clear. Nanak felt an odd pull as he stepped into the middle of the circle. He could almost feel the earth beneath him, pulsing softly, responding to his presence. His niece walked up beside him, her eyes studying the stones with the same quiet curiosity. "Do you think the stories live here too?" "I believe," Nanak replied, "that these stones are a place where stories come to rest. They hold the memories of the past, waiting for those who can listen." They stood there for a while, the wind gently shifting the snow around them, the sky above slowly dimming as the day moved toward dusk. Nanak closed his eyes for a moment, his mind drifting. The quiet stillness of the place seemed to reach into him, settling into his bones like a gentle warmth. Then, just as the last light of day began to fade, something stirred, a sound of soft rustling, almost like a whisper, coming from one of the stones. Nanak opened his eyes, his heart quickening slightly. "Did you hear that?" his niece asked, her voice barely audible. Nanak nodded, his attention focused on the sound. It wasn't quite a word, but it was a rhythm, a pattern. He could feel it in the air around them, vibrating through his very skin. And then, from the stone directly in front of him, a faint image began to emerge, a swirling pattern, like a story being written in the air. It was faint at first, just a soft glow, but then the light grew stronger, and the image became clearer. Figures appeared within it, a procession of people walking across a vast, frozen landscape. Their faces were obscured, but their movements were purposeful, determined. They were carrying something, a great weight. Across the snow, Nanuq felt his breath catch in his throat as the image continued to unfold. The figures moved slowly, their steps deliberate, as though they were following the same path he and his niece had taken. The scene shifted again, showing the people standing at the edge of a great, icy cliff, looking down at something in the distance. "It's a story," Nanak whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "A story from long ago." His niece leaned forward, her eyes wide with wonder. What happens next? But just as the question left her lips, the image began to fade. The figures dissolved into the swirling glow, their faces now lost to the mist of time. The light from the stone dimmed, and the air around them grew still once again. Nanak stood there, watching as the last remnants of the vision disappeared. He could still feel the pull of it, the weight of the story lingering in the air. But the path was clear now. He knew what he had to do. "They've shown us the way," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "The story is still unfolding, and we are part of it." His niece nodded, her gaze still fixed on the stone. "But how do we follow it?" she asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Nanuq smiled, his eyes soft with understanding. "We follow the footprints," he said, taking a step back toward the path they had walked. "The footprints are still there, guiding us forward, and the stories will always be waiting." With that, they turned away from the stones and began their descent down the hill, the quiet hum of the world around them filling the space between their words. The path ahead was still uncertain, but with each step, they were one step closer to the answers they sought. The stories would come, and they would be ready to listen. The moon was beginning its rise, casting a soft, silver glow across the snowy landscape. Nanak and his niece walked quietly, the only sound now the gentle crunch of snow beneath their feet. The stones behind them were mere shadows in the distance, their presence fading into the vastness of the frozen world. Yet the story they had revealed to Nanak lingered in his mind like a song he couldn't quite remember. "There's something different about tonight, isn't there?" his niece asked, her voice carrying a hint of awe. Nanak glanced up at the moon, now climbing higher in the sky, its light more intense, as if it too were watching over them. He thought about the vision they had witnessed, the figures in the snow, the weight they carried, the quiet determination in their steps. He couldn't shake the feeling that they had just glimpsed the beginning of something far greater than they could have imagined. "It's like the world is waiting for us to understand something," Nanak replied, his voice thoughtful. "Something we don't yet know, but we're getting closer." His niece walked beside him, her footsteps steady but light, as if she were aware of the stillness around them. She glanced up at him, her eyes filled with the quiet wonder that had been a part of her since the beginning of their journey. "Do you think we'll ever know all the stories?" Nanak smiled down at her, his heart warmed by the innocence of the question. "I think, my dear, that we'll know the ones we need to know, the stories that will help us find our way." They walked in silence for a while longer, the cold air biting at their cheeks, the snowflakes catching in the light and swirling gently around them. The night was calm, the world holding its breath, as if nature itself was waiting for the next. Chapter 2 Unfold. Ahead, the footprints they had been following continued, their faint glow guiding the way. The path seemed to stretch out before them, leading through the vast, silent expanse of snow-covered ground. But as they moved closer, Nanak noticed something new, something unexpected. The footprints had started to split, branching off in several directions. His heart skipped a beat. For a moment, he wasn't sure which way to go. The paths before them were all equally mysterious, all equally inviting. "We've come to a choice," Nanak murmured, his gaze fixed on the branching paths. "Which one do we take?" His niece stopped beside him, her eyes scanning the trails ahead. She tilted her head, considering the options, as if the right answer was just waiting to be discovered. "I don't know," she said after a long pause. "But maybe it doesn't matter which one we choose. Maybe we're supposed to trust ourselves." Nanak looked down at her, his chest swelling with pride. She was wise beyond her years. He had never doubted her, but in this moment, he felt the weight of his own uncertainty. He had followed the path for so long, always one step behind, always a little unsure of what was to come. Perhaps it was time to trust, to let go. "You're right," he said, his voice steady. "We don't have to know exactly what's ahead. All we have to do is take the next step." And so, together, they chose the path to the left, the one that seemed to shimmer just a little brighter in the moonlight. As they began to walk down the new trail, the air grew colder, but the ground beneath their feet felt firmer, more certain. The footprints grew clearer with every step they took. Nanak felt a strange sense of reassurance, as if they were being watched over, as if the land itself were guiding them forward. His niece, ever the quiet observer, seemed to sense it too, walking just a little bit closer to him. For a while, they continued in silence, the world around them shrinking into a soft, quiet blur. The snowflakes were falling in a steady rhythm now, like a gentle, rhythmic lullaby that seemed to slow time itself. And then, up ahead, they saw it, the source of the faint glow that had been illuminating their path. A small, frozen lake, its surface smooth and undisturbed by the wind. The moon hung directly above it, casting a silver sheen over the water, turning the ice into something almost magical. Nanak stopped, his breath catching in his chest. His niece stepped forward, her fingers brushing the edge of the ice. She looked at Nanak, her eyes wide. "Do you think it's safe?" Nanak didn't answer immediately. He knelt beside her, his hand gently brushing the surface of the ice. It was cold, yes, but there was something else about its stillness that was almost otherworldly. It felt ancient, as if the lake had always been here, quietly waiting for those who could see. I think, Nanak began. "This is where the stories come together." His niece tilted her head, as if she could feel the pull of his words. "What do you mean?" "I think," Nanak said softly, "this lake is the heart of the path we've been following. It's where the footprints lead, where the stories begin and end. And now, it's time for us to listen. They stood there, in the stillness of the night, the moon reflecting off the ice in a soft, silvery glow. The world felt suspended, as though time itself had slowed down, waiting for them to understand something deeper. Nanuq placed his hands on the ice, feeling the vibrations beneath his fingertips. He closed his eyes, allowing the stillness of the moment to fill him, to soothe him. And then, just as the quiet reached its peak, something stirred beneath the ice. A faint ripple, a subtle shift that sent a tremor through the frozen surface. Nanok's heart raced, but he didn't move, didn't break the silence. He waited. Then, with a suddenness that took his breath away, a figure began to emerge from beneath the ice. It was faint at first, like a shadow rising from the depths. But as it grew clearer, Nanak realized it was a person, standing tall and still, gazing at them with quiet, knowing eyes. Nanak's voice was barely a whisper, a story. It's a story, coming to life. His niece reached for his hand, her eyes wide in awe. "Who is it?" "I don't know yet," Nanak replied, his voice trembling. "But I think we're about to find out." The figure emerged slowly from the ice, like a vision formed from the deepest part of winter itself. Nanak could feel his pulse quicken as he watched, mesmerized by the scene unfolding before them. The figure was tall, cloaked in layers of fur that shimmered with the same silver light that bathed the lake. Its face was hidden beneath the hood, but there was an unmistakable presence or calm power, a knowing that reached across the ages. His niece, wide-eyed, squeezed his hand tighter. "Is it a spirit?" she whispered, her voice barely audible against the gentle hum of the wind. Nanuq didn't immediately answer. The figure was neither threatening nor benign, yet there was something in its stillness that commanded respect. It did not move closer, but rather stood at the edge of the frozen water, as though waiting for them to make the next move. The air around them seemed to thicken with meaning, and Nanak could almost feel the weight of the moment, as if the entire universe had paused to watch. The moon hung above, its light casting long shadows over the snow and ice. Time felt as if it had stretched, becoming both vast and intimate in the same instant. Every breath Nanak took seemed to reverberate with the energy of the figure before them. He felt the stirrings of something ancient, something that lived in the land and in the stories that had been passed down through the generations. And yet, this was something new, something that neither he nor his niece had ever experienced. Finally, the figure moved. It raised its arms slowly, and as it did, the ice beneath their feet seemed to shimmer, as though the surface of the lake itself were breathing. The moonlight caught on the figure's cloak, revealing a pattern of intricate symbols etched with care into the fabric. They glowed faintly, like a language forgotten by time. "Do you see it?" Nanak whispered, leaning closer to his niece. "The symbols, they're part of the story. This is how we find our way." The figure lowered its arms and turned toward the lake, the movement so fluid it almost seemed unnatural. It gestured to the ice, as if inviting them to approach. Without a word, Nanak took a step forward, his feet light upon the frozen surface, and his niece followed, her small footsteps barely making a sound. They reached the edge of the lake, where the figure stood, and Nanak could feel the strange warmth emanating from it. It was as though the figure held a secret, something that had been buried beneath layers of ice and time. waiting for them to discover it. The figure didn't speak, but its presence was enough. Nanak understood. This was not a figure to be feared. It was a guide, a keeper of stories. Its role was to lead them deeper into the heart of the journey, to reveal the threads that connected the past to the present and perhaps even the future. His niece, never one to shy away from curiosity, stepped closer to the figure. "What are the symbols?" she asked softly, her voice filled with wonder. The figure turned its gaze toward her, and for a moment Nanak saw something shift in its ease of flicker of recognition, as if it had been waiting for her question. The figure's hands, like feathers, brushing the air, moved to the symbols on its cloak, and with a single motion they began to glow brighter, the light intensifying until it was almost blinding. The wind picked up, and Nanak could feel it swirling around them, a soft, whispering sound. He closed his eyes, letting the sensation wash over him. The symbols on the figure's cloak flickered like fireflies, each one pulsing in a rhythm that was both familiar and foreign, like a heartbeat echoing through time. "I think," Nanak began, but his words faltered as he tried to understand the meaning of the symbols. There was something in them, something that was beyond his understanding, but somehow not beyond his reach. "I think these symbols are the stories of the people who came before us." His niece looked up at him, her expression one of quiet awe. "What do they want us to do?" Nanak didn't have an answer immediately. He watched the figure, whose hands were still raised toward the symbols, each one glowing with increasing intensity. The light from the symbols spread out, rippling across the ice like waves on water. And then, slowly, the ripples began to form shape. The shapes were figures moving across the surface of the lake, their forms translucent but unmistakably human. They were walking just as they had in the vision earlier. Nanak felt his heart race as he recognized the same figures from the stones carrying something, moving toward the same frozen cliff. "They're showing us," Nanak said, his voice barely a whisper, "the story we've been searching for. It's all connected." The figures on the ice moved in a slow procession, their steps deliberate and steady. But Nanak could feel something different now. The figures weren't simply part of the past, they were part of the present too. The symbols, the figures, very ice beneath their feet, it was all a living, breathing story that was unfolding with each passing moment. And then, as if to confirm his thoughts, the figure turned toward them once again. Its eyes locked with Nanak's, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. There was no wind, no sound, no movement only, the quiet gaze of the figure and the steady pulse of the symbols that surrounded them. "You are ready," the figure seemed to say, not with words, but with the deep resonance of its presence. Nanak felt a calm certainty settle within him. The journey was far from over, but they were no longer lost. The stories they sought were not just something from the past, they were living, breathing things, waiting to be uncovered. His niece looked at him, her eyes wide, her heart racing. "What now?" Nanak smiled gently, feeling the weight of the journey ahead, but also the strength of the path they had chosen. "Now we follow the story. We trust the signs, the symbols, and the footsteps. The stories have always been with us." And so they stepped forward once again, their feet leaving soft imprints on the ice, following the path laid out before them. The world was vast, and the stories were many, but with each step, they were uncovering the truth of what had been hidden for so long. The air had grown colder as they stepped further onto the frozen lake. Each step they took seemed to echo louder in the stillness, as though the ice itself was holding its breath. Nanak couldn't help but notice how the symbols on the figure's cloak continued to glow, pulsing softly in time with his heartbeat. It was as if the figure was not just guiding them physically, but emotionally and spiritually as well. Each symbol telling a story he couldn't quite comprehend, but felt within. His niece, walking beside him, reached down to touch the surface of the ice, her small hand brushing against the cold, smooth texture. "It feels different now," she said softly, "like we're walking on something alive." Nanak nodded, unable to articulate the strange sensation that had settled deep in his chest. There was something profound about this plaza sense, of ancient wisdom, a memory of something forgotten but never truly lost. It was as though they were walking through the layers of time itself, peeling back each moment to reveal another, all leading to a singular truth. Ahead, the figures on the ice moved forward, their procession continuing as if they were walking toward something just out of sight. Nanak found himself drawn to them, feeling a pull he couldn't resist. The figures weren't just figures anymore. They were part of him, part of the story. They were all living. "Do you think they're us?" his niece asked, her voice trembling slightly as she gazed at the figures. "Or are they ... the ones who came before?" Nanak thought about the question as they walked. It was a good question. The figures felt familiar, yet distant, like echoes from a time long past. But in that moment, he realized something. They weren't just echoes. They were all connected. Past, present, and future were all woven together in the intricate tapestry of the world. "They are both," he answered softly. "The ones who came before are guiding us now, and we, in turn, will guide those who come after." His niece looked up at him, her eyes wide with the weight of his words. "But how? How do we guide them?" Nanak smiled gently, knowing that the answer wasn't something he could fully explain. It wasn't about giving directions or writing down steps on a map. It was about living the story, being a part of it, feeling it, and then passing it on. "We guide them by living," he said, "by remembering what we've learned and sharing it. The stories are always there, waiting to be told, waiting to be heard." As they continued, the figures ahead of them began to fade in and out of sight, their forms becoming more and more ethereal. The ice beneath their feet began to crack, small fissures appearing in the surface. But Nanak didn't feel fear. Instead, he felt a strange calmness, as though the cracking ice was just another part of the story they were walking through ahead. The crack in the ice deepened, forming a narrow gap that seemed to stretch for miles. The figures had now disappeared completely, leaving behind only the faintest glow, like the remnants of a dream. Nanak paused, feeling the sudden weight of the silence around them. The world felt so still, so vast. "We have to cross it," he said, more to himself than to his niece. The crack in the ice seemed to beckon them, inviting them to take the next step into the unknown. His niece looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "Is it safe?" Nanak gazed down at the crack, his heart steady. He had no way of knowing for sure, but he understood that the next step was always a leap of faith. The stories they had followed had led them to this point, and now it was up to them to keep moving forward. It's the only way, he said simply. Together, they stepped onto the cracked ice, their feet sinking slightly with each movement. The ice creaked and groaned beneath them, but it held, steady and firm. Nanak felt the strange energy in the air, as if the earth itself were holding them up, guiding them forward with invisible hands. They crossed the gap, the ice stretching out before them, and as they did, the world around them seemed to shift. The sky above darkened slightly, the stars twinkling more brightly, casting their light onto the ice below. The glow from the symbols had dimmed, but in its place, something new had emerged, a soft, golden light that radiated from the very ground. Beneath them, Nanak paused, feeling the ground beneath his feet, the vibrations now pulsing gently through his body. It was as though the ice was no longer just frozen water. It was something living, something that had absorbed the stories of the land and the people who had walked on it. Look, his niece said, pointing ahead. The golden light was growing, stronger, illuminating a shape just beyond the horizon. It was distant, but its presence was undeniable. It's a city, Nanak murmured, his voice filled with awe. The figure in the distance was made of stone, but unlike any structure he had ever seen before. It was ancient, yet strangely modern, as if it existed outside of time. They continued walking toward it, each step bringing them closer to the mystery that awaited them. The crack in the ice had closed behind them, and the path before them was clear. The air felt warmer now, the chill of the night retreating in the presence of the golden light. "What do you think it is?" his niece asked, her voice full of wonder. "I don't know yet," Nanak replied, "but I think it's where the story ends and begins again." And so they walked forward together, the soft glow of the city ahead guiding their way. Stories had led them here, and now they were about to discover the next chapter. With each step, they felt closer to the heart of the journey, to the truth that had been hidden beneath layers of ice and time. They didn't know what the city held, but they knew one thing: they were ready. The golden light grew brighter as they drew nearer, casting long, soft shadows across the ice. The city in the distance was now undeniably towering stone structures rising from the frozen ground like ancient sentinels, each one engraved with intricate patterns, almost like the symbols on the figure's cloak. The closer they got, the more the air seemed to hum with energy, as if the very stones were alive, pulsing with the stories of those who had built it. Nanak felt his heart race in anticipation, though his steps remained slow, deliberate. His niece walked beside him, her small hand in his, her eyes wide with wonder. The city was unlike anything they had ever seen, a place that felt as though it had existed before time itself, yet had never been discovered by anyone who lived now. What is this place? But I think we're about to find out. The air had become warmer now, the chill of the night retreating as they moved closer to the city. The snow beneath their feet had changed, becoming softer and more resilient, as though it, too, was part of the living landscape that had been waiting for them to arrive. It was as if the world had shifted, and they were no longer just travelers. They were part of something much larger as they passed through the first towering archway of the city. The golden light enveloped them, and Nanak felt a sense of peace wash over him. It wasn't the kind of peace one feels after a long journey, but rather a peace that resonated deep within his bones, as if the land itself was greeting them, welcoming them home, this place. Nanak whispered to himself, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. It feels like the beginning of everything. They continued walking, the city's stone walls towering above them, their surfaces smooth and worn by centuries, if not millennia, of time. The streets were quiet, but not empty. The soft echo of their footsteps reverberated against the stone, and Nanak noticed, for the first time, the faintest traces of symbols etched into the walls, nearly invisible to the untrained eye. They seemed to glow softly, like whispers of forgotten stories. His niece pointed to one of the symbols, her finger tracing the delicate lines in the air. "Look, Nanak, it's the same as the ones we saw earlier, the ones on the figure." Nanak nodded, feeling the weight of her observation. "Yes, the same symbol. They're telling a story, one we've only just begun to understand." As they continued down the main thoroughfare, they passed buildings that looked as though they had been carved directly from the ice and stone of the land itself. Some of them were large and imposing, while others were smaller, more intimate. They seemed to hold within them the secrets of generations of people who had once lived here or perhaps still did. "I feel like we're not alone," his niece said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. Nanak looked around, sensing the same thing. There was an energy here, a presence that felt just out of reach, like a whisper on the wind. It was as though the city itself was watching them, waiting for them to uncover the truths it had been hiding for so long. They approached a grand central square, where a massive stone structure stood at the center. It was shaped like an ancient temple, but unlike any temple Nanak had ever seen. The walls were adorned with more of the glowing symbols, and the air around it seemed to vibrate with a quiet intensity. "This is it," Nanak said softly, his voice filled with reverence. "This is where the story leads." The square was silent, save for the sound of the wind rustling through the trees that lined its edges. The stone temple loomed before them, its doorways wide open, inviting them inside. Nanak could feel pull of the place, like it was drawing him in, urging him to step forward and discover what lay within. His niece looked up at him, her eyes filled with curiosity and a hint of fear. "What do we do now?" Nanak took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. This was the culmination of their journey, the place where everything they had learned would come together. It was no longer just about following the symbols or uncovering the secrets of the past. It was about understanding the connection between all things, the past, the present, and the future. "We go inside," Nanak said gently, squeezing her hand. "We go inside, and we listen to the stories the city has to tell us." They stepped into the temple, the air inside cool and filled with the scent of ancient stone and wood. The interior was vast, the ceiling high above them, its surface covered in more of the glowing symbols. In the center of the room stood a massive stone altar, its surface worn smooth by centuries of use. Around the altar were smaller stone tablets, each one etched with symbols that seemed to pulse with energy. "This is where it all comes together," Nanak murmured, his voice reverent as he gazed around the room. The symbols on the walls, altar, the tablets, all of them, were part of the same story, a story that spanned generations and reached across time itself. His niece stepped forward, her small fingers brushing against one of the stone tablets. As she touched it, the symbols on the walls flickered, their light growing brighter, then fading, then growing brighter again. Nanak's heart quickened as he realized that the symbols were responding to them, They were part of the story now, and the story was alive. "This is where the story ends," he said softly, "and where it begins again." Together, they stood in the heart of the temple, surrounded by the stories of the past, present, and future, each one waiting to be uncovered. And as the symbols on the walls shimmered and the light from the altar flickered, Nanak knew one thing for certain. This was not the end of their journey. It was only the beginning. The flickering glow of the symbols around them seemed to pulse more rapidly now, like the heartbeat of the temple itself. The soft hum in the air grew louder, vibrating through their bones, until it felt as though the entire room was alive, breathing in tandem with them. Nanak took a slow, deep breath, letting the sensation of being so deeply connected to the ancient place wash over him. The symbols on the walls flickered in response, as though acknowledging his presence, inviting him deeper into the story. They had been weaving for eons. Nanak turned to his niece, who was standing beside him, her wide eyes fixed on the altar in front of them. Her small hand still rested lightly against the stone tablet, and the symbols around her seemed to glow brighter, as if they recognized her touch. She glanced up at him, her face illuminated by the golden light that now filled the temple. "Do you think they're waiting for us?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper, as though speaking any louder might disrupt the delicate energy in the air. Nan Yu nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the symbols around them. "I think they're guiding us, just like they've guided everyone before us." They stood there for a moment longer, enveloped in the hum of the room, until Nanak felt the pull of the altar once more. There was something compelling about it, something ancient and powerful. He knew that they were meant to move forward, to touch the heart of the story they had been walking toward all along. "Come on," Nanak said, his voice calm but firm. "We need to go closer." They moved forward, the floor beneath their feet cool and solid, the vibrations in the air growing more intense with each step. As they approached the altar, Nanak noticed something new. The stone tablets surrounding it, which had appeared dormant at first, were now shifting slightly, as if they were part of a larger puzzle that was beginning to unlock itself. His niece reached out to touch the nearest tablet, and as her fingers brushed against it, the symbols on the stone glowed in response, brighter than ever before. A low, melodic sound filled the temple, emanating from the stones themselves, a sound that seemed to resonate deep within Nanak's chest. This is what we've been looking for," he murmured, almost to himself. "The answers are here, in the story they've been waiting to tell." He stepped forward, his hand resting gently on the altar. As soon as his fingers made contact, air in the room shifted, the vibrations intensified, and the symbols around them began to swirl in a slow, circular motion, as though they were being pulled into the center of the altar. For a moment, everything around them went still, as though the entire world was holding its breath. Nanak could feel the energy in the room build, filling every corner of the temple with the weight of centuries of knowledge, wisdom, and stories long forgotten. Then, as if in response to an unspoken command, the symbols began to arrange themselves into a new pattern, a sequence that Nanak recognized at least. He thought he did. The symbols appeared to tell a story, one that stretched across time, one that was both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. They spoke of a time before. The land had frozen before the world had divided into nations and tribes. They spoke of a unity, a connection that had existed between all things, a connection that had been lost over time but was now, in some way, being found again. The glowing symbols on the altar seemed to pulse in time with Nanok's heartbeat, their rhythm a gentle reminder that he was not just a spectator in this story, he was a part of it. The connection he felt, the pull of the past and future, was real. It was not just an illusion. The world they had stepped into was not just a city, but a living memory of everything that had come before. Nanok's eyes shifted to his niece, who stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the symbols. The light reflected in her eyes, filling her. With a quiet wonder, he could see that she, too, understood. They were standing at the intersection of all things, the past, the present, and the future, just as the city had always been. The sound from the altar grew louder, the melody now filling the space with a soft, harmonious tune that seemed to carry the very essence of the story forward. Nanok closed his eyes for a moment, allowing the music to wash over him, letting the energy of the room settle into his soul. The journey they had undertaken, the cold, the isolation, the uncertainty, had led them here to this moment of discovery. And while the answers were still unfolding before him, he knew that this was a turning point, a place where the stories would begin to converge, just as they always had. He felt his niece's hand slip into his, the warmth of her small fingers, grounding him in the present moment. He opened his eyes and looked at her, seeing the wonder in her gaze as she watched the patterns of the symbols shift and change, becoming something new with each passing second. "What does it mean, Nanok?" she asked softly, her voice filled with both curiosity and awe. Nanok smiled gently, feeling a deep sense of peace settle over him. "I don't think it has just one meaning," he said, his voice calm and steady. "I think it's a reminder that we are all part of the story, the ones who came before us, the ones who will come after, and everyone in between. The past is not just a memory, it's a living thing, and we are living it right now." His niece looked up at him, her expression thoughtful. "So, we're part of the story, too." "Exactly," Nanok said, his heart swelling with the realization. "We're not just telling the story, we're living it." As the symbols continued to shift and swirl around them, Nanok felt the energy of the room grow even stronger, its presence a steady hum that resonated with the deepest part of his being. He was no longer just a traveler in this place. He was a participant in the story, a story that had no beginning and no end, but that would always be told in every generation by those who chose to listen and remember. Together, they stood in the center of the temple, surrounded by the stories of the past, the present, and the future. And as the symbols around them continued to pulse with light, Nanok knew that they had found something more than just an answer. They had found a truth that would stay with them, and with anyone who dared to listen, for as long as the stories continued to be told. The temple began to quiet. The soft vibrations dimmed into a lull, and the dancing light from the glowing symbols now pulsed in slower waves, like the last flickers of twilight before night fully embraces the earth. Nanok stood still, hand still resting on the altar stone, as if afraid to break the spell by stepping away. But the spell had already worked its way into them. It wasn't something they had to hold on to. Physically, it was already inside, woven into memory and breath. His niece gave his hand a light squeeze. "It's beautiful," she said, "like they were waiting for us to remember." Nanak nodded, his throat tight with something that wasn't sadness or fear. It was awe, a quiet awe that carried the weight of generations. The kind you didn't talk over. The tablets, once glowing brightly, had begun to fade into a soft, warm bronze hue, as though satisfied. The temple, too, seemed to be relaxing, as if its purpose had been fulfilled, at least for now. "Do you think we can come back?" she asked, not with urgency, but with the calm curiosity of someone who had seen something rare and knew better than to assume it would stay. Nanak turned to her, brushing a strand of hair away from her face. "I think once you find a story like this," he said gently, "you carry it with you. Wherever you go, it goes too." Outside the temple, the wind had slowed. Snow still drifted in delicate spirals, but the sky had begun to lighten with the early shades of dawn. Nanak hadn't realized they had spent the whole night inside, yet it felt like no time had passed at all. They stepped out, the crisp morning air kissing their cheeks. Nanak turned once to look back at the temple entrance. It looked so ordinary now, silent, still, half covered in snow, as though the city had never stirred at all. But he knew better. He reached into the small side pouch he always carried and pulled out the sealskin notebook his grandfather had given him. He hadn't written in it for months, not since before their journey had begun. It had felt too empty, like he had nothing worth preserving. Now that had changed. He opened to a fresh page. With numb fingers, he began to write, not quickly, but carefully, allowing the story to come in its own rhythm. He wrote about the journey, about the dreams, about the snow-lost landmarks that had led them here, about the city buried in frost, in history, and the lights that danced like stories across stone. His niece sat beside him, legs curled beneath her, watching the sunrise paint the snow in amber and pink. She didn't speak. She just sat, knowing instinctively not to interrupt the quiet that had settled over them. The final symbol from the temple was etched in Nanak's mind, a spiral open in the center, ever expanding, a symbol of continuing, of memory that never truly sleeps. He drew it on the last line of the page and closed the notebook. "Well," he said, with a stretch and a yawn, "we've got a long walk back." His niece looked over her shoulder toward the mountain trail. "It doesn't feel as long now," she said. "Feels ... lighter," he smiled. "That's what a good story does." They started walking, their boots crunching softly over the fresh snow. The mountain loomed behind them, unchanged and unmoving, but something had shifted. The air itself felt clearer, lighter, yes, not because anything had been left behind, but because something ancient had been remembered. Their shadows stretched ahead in the low morning sun, the light painting long silhouettes of two travelers who had found more than they had sought. The city would fade back into snow, as it always did. The temple would sleep again, but the story would travel onward in their steps, in their breath, in the quiet places between heartbeats. Somewhere far below the ice, the symbols waited, patient, unhurried. They had all the time in the world. And so, with each step, the story continued, not just written in stone or in old books, but in the shared silence between an uncle and his niece, in the warmth of footprints side by side, in the wind that gently rustled the snow. And for the first time in a long time, Nanak did not dread the cold. It was a companion now, a reminder that even in the stillest frost, stories sleep with one eye open. Word count 1081. Wind down summary 300 words, and now As you settle deeper into your bed, let your thoughts drift like snowflakes in a gentle storm. Picture Nanak and his niece, their figures slowly fading into the light of a rising sun. Imagine their footsteps trailing behind them, soft, quiet, perfectly spaced as they walk away from a city that may or may not exist. The symbols carved into stone still glow faintly, even now, even in your mind. Their message was never meant to be shouted or hurried, only whispered, only passed gently, like a shared breath on a cold morning. Breathe slowly now. Feel your body ease into stillness. Let each breath melt into the next, as if you, too, have stepped inside a story meant only for dreamers and wanderers. Let the quiet hum of ancient memory settle into your chest. You are warm, safe. You are part of something older than mountains and kinder than silence. There is no rush to return. The wind has calmed. The stars above are holding their place. Just for you, you can stay here as long as you like. And when you wake, the story will still be with you, curled gently in your thoughts. A soft spiral of meaning you don't need to explain. Sleep well, traveler.